Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the tone of last year's Brexit campaign was toxic and has led to the demonisation of immigrants. That's according to the head of a group of MPs. The group says migrants should be treated as Britons in waiting who can eventually gain citizenship instead of being viewed as security threats, and says the government should do more to encourage meaningful social mixing. There have also been repeated calls for compulsory English lessons, which they want funded through a student loan style system. Well, the group is chaired by anti-Brexit Labour MP Chuka Umunna.
We think far too little about what actually happens when people come to our country and settle here. And too often we have immigrants who, are not properly integrated into their communities. And that's bad for them because it stands in the way of them being able to access all the opportunities there are. And it's bad for the overall community because there's a lack of trust there. And where there is a lack of trust in a vacuum like that, that's where the peddlers of hatred and division step in. And unfortunately, we saw that far too much during the EU referendum. And frankly, frontline politicians who should have known better should have been far more responsible in the way they were discussing these issues.
Well, joining us now is Sabrina Huck, a German immigrant who moved to the UK 3 years ago. We also have the director of the organisation Migrant Voice, Nazak Ramadan, and Tim Swift, the leader of Calderdale Council in Halifax, which is one of the towns that struggles with immigration. I want to start with you, Tim, if I may. Talk to us a little bit about the communities that make up your area and the challenges that you face.
Okay, so the dominant minority community in Calderdale is of Pakistani origin. It's a long-established community. We have families going back 3 generations, but there are challenges about the white community and the Asian community to some extent leading separate lives. And I think some of the proposals in the report are very much to be welcomed. I mean, we find that as new people join that community, generally people want to learn English, and actually one of the issues is that the lessons and courses simply aren't there. I think
so, Tim, forgive me for jumping in, but I just want to know, you say that very often Pakistani community and the white community are leading very separate lives. Why do you think that is happening now? I
think partly it's human nature. You gravitate towards areas where where the facilities that serve your particular needs and interests are. I think in some ways changing policy has made that worse, particularly over issues like schooling and parental choice. And I think changes in the job market. Many of the first-generation Pakistani immigrants came to work in textile business, which were actually quite well integrated. As those businesses have disappeared, some of those opportunities for people to meet in the workplace have weakened rather than strengthened.
I want to bring in Nazak. Is that something that you find with your work, that generally communities across the country are very segregated?
Well, we have a little bit of different picture within our membership. I mean, we've conducted research just a couple of years ago with many of our members across the UK in 3 cities, London, Birmingham and Glasgow. And just under 200 people actually participated, and where migrants spoke about the impact of the debate on their integration. And we discovered that lots of people felt were integrated in the local community, but actually what stopped them from feeling, getting this sense of belonging to the UK as a country was mainly the way the politicians spoke negatively about them and the way the media reported their issue or represented them.
Well, that's interesting, so I want to bring Sabrina in at this point. Do you feel that you're integrated into British society? You've been here, what, 3 years now?
Yeah, I've been here 3 years, and I do feel integrated and do feel part of society, but it is the case that sometimes people seem surprised when you, as like a foreign person, take interest, for example, in in politics, current affairs of the country, because everyone expects you to be focused on where you're from. So people are even surprised if you know who the Prime Minister is, things like that sometimes, yeah. So, and it's bizarre, you know, you have a conversation with somebody and people make these sort of assumptions about you. And obviously for me, coming from a Western European country that's seen as respected, it's easier. So I don't.
Well, that's interesting. I wanted to ask you, because coming from Germany, I wonder if you are made to feel more welcome than maybe other nations, would you think?
I mean, recently, I think all Europeans have been feeling very unwelcomed, and including not just people with low skills. I think many people who are academics and high-skilled Europeans are deciding to leave, and some of them actually have left, and the others have plans to leave because they feel unwelcome.
Do you feel unwelcome?
It does make you feel unwelcome when you go down the shop, for example, and you see the headlines in the Daily Mail, the Express and the Sun that is like basically scapegoating European citizens, particularly during the European referendum. So I know that it makes you feel a lot more self-conscious, for example, to use the NHS, because you see all the headlines everywhere about like European migrants destroying public services. And I think a lot of people from Europe are really considering whether or not to stay here, to start a family, things like that, because it doesn't feel like the right place to do that.
Tim, do you think post the Brexit vote that there has been less integration and people feeling that they have to go back into their own communities? They're not welcome.
I think it was quite damaging, and that affected people of British Asian heritage as much as it is as European immigrants. So I've heard stories of British citizens of Asian heritage who experienced sort of overtly racist comments on the street in a way that hadn't been happening for years before. And of course then stories like that spread in the community, and it does make people feel feel less secure in their place in society.
So the idea of compulsory English lessons that people have to pay back in a kind of student loan style, do you think that's going to help?
I think a lot of people are really, really keen to learn English when they come here and they don't speak English yet. But I think one of the big problems is that the system, the way it's designed, isn't very accessible, and that just doesn't start only by like what sort of funding is available, but also where do I go? You know, like how can I find the resources? It's really, really difficult to navigate the system if you don't have the language skills already.
I mean, I guess you need to make English classes available before you make them compulsory. I think the problem is we used to have lots of English classes, and now they're running. The government cut all the funding to English classes, or most of them, and it's very difficult for a migrant now to find an English class. We speak, many of our migrants, including now the Syrian refugees, who say, I'm desperate to learn the language, I'm desperate to find out about this country, where I can't find the classes, can you help us? So, I mean, they're not there. I think it's important not to blame people for not wanting to learn the language. I think all migrants, the first priority is to learn English, but where do they go to get classes?
Tim, what do you think would be a single thing or a couple of things that would make a massive difference in Colesdale, where you are, to improve that integration?
Well, I agree with a lot of what's just been said about English classes and access to them. I think also the quality of them is important. I think we want some certainty about policies and support. I think too often we see short-term government initiatives. Everybody dashes around to try and win a little bit of funding. Actually, we need some certainty. And we need to recognise that the situation in northern towns like Halifax is very different from some of the big cities with very diverse and rapidly changing population. So we need the flexibility, which is flagged up in the report, to put the right policies in place that suit the local community.
Thank you very much for joining us, all of you. I'm very grateful to you for speaking to us. Now, a government spokesperson told us that they've made £140 million available through the Controlling Migration Fund to build community cohesion and encourage the integration of recent migrants, including a number of projects focusing on English language education.
A group of MPs says the tone of the EU referendum campaign was poisonous and that it has fuelled the demonisation of immigrants. Well, yesterday, figures showed that immigration to the UK has fallen to its lowest level for 3 years, driven in part by thousands of EU citizens leaving since the Brexit vote. Joining us now to discuss this from Bristol is Nicholas Hatton, co-chair of the campaign group, the 3 Million. Nicholas, many thanks for being with us. First, for viewers who aren't aware of the 3 Million, just explain a little bit about your group. That 3 million, a reference, I presume, to EU citizens living here.
Yes, absolutely. Good morning, Neil. We set up the 3 million after the referendum because there's a lot of uncertainty about our future, and people were very anxious. At the time, we saw a rise in hate crimes at the same time, so we needed to do something, and it was done in a very informal way. We just normal citizens. We came from another member state, but we never thought ourselves as migrants. We just went to a different part of Europe and built our lives here. I've got a British wife, a British daughter. A lot of us are in the same situation. So it's that reality of being Europeans, and it really hit us with the referendum.
Well, Nicholas, then, with your very close links to the United Kingdom, I mean, what do you make of that assessment by the cross-party group of MPs saying that the tone of that EU referendum campaign was poisonous, that whether intentionally or otherwise, it has led directly to the demonisation of people like yourself who've been living here for many years?
Well, it's hard to argue that there was no demonisation and that immigration was used for political gain. And I think that it's a real shame, because we can argue on immigration and what should be the policy, but people are people, and we should not demonize the people that have come here because a system was in place. I think that personally Britain has benefited from immigration greatly, culturally, economically, and has done for a very long time. Maybe there is a need for conversations on immigrations, but not on the demonization of people. This is just not acceptable. I think the debate on racism has been closed for a long time now, so it should be the same thing about xenophobia.
There are plenty of people who make the argument that, you know, immigration has been a benefit to this country, that there are industries from fruit picking all the way up to, you know, to the National Health Service that couldn't survive without it. I mean, from your perspective, do you think that the politicians at the very top level have been making that positive case for immigration?
I think that it's been an issue that is like the white elephant in the room. Immigration has been used positively by business leaders and by public services to fill the skills gaps in the British economy. So when you know, 1 million Polish people came to this country in the noughties, it was because there were jobs, and we needed to fill these jobs. The skills shortage is a very British problem in that sense. The economy grew because these workers worked here, contributed to the economy. But then obviously there's a more cultural question about what are the values of Britain. Are these people from abroad integrating and becoming British in a way? And I think that this report is trying to do is to find a solution for the long-term integration of people, whether if they're going to stay.
Just on that point, I mean, you mentioned integration, and certainly for immigration to be net positive, there has to be integration. I mean, but where does that start? Many people suggesting that, you know, a prerequisite for entry to the United Kingdom should at least be the ability to speak basic English.
Well, this is already happening, and it's causing problems. So, for example, if you're a nurse living in the EU and you want to work in the NHS, there are recruitment bureaus across Europe to recruit these nurses because of the shortage. There is a need to have a certain level of English, and that level of English is actually higher than the level required by foreign students. So that has led to a very significant drop in application. I think English is obviously, you know, who would not like to speak English in England? You can't do anything if you don't speak the language. It's quite obvious. The report is suggesting mandatory classes. I think they're English classes. The trouble we've got is funding has been reduced for these classes. So the need is there. migrants coming to these countries are put on a waiting list. So if we are serious about integration, I think we also need to fund the integration through English classes, through the creation of a strategic unit at the cabinet. So immigration is managed proactively rather than reactively.
Nicholas Hatton, actually, judging by your accent, I should probably be saying Nicolas Hatton. Many thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, Neil. Thank you.
Let's talk to Chaka Muna, who's the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Social Integration. He joins us from West London. Mr. Muna, thanks a lot for joining us this afternoon. You chaired the group. You went to
Pleasure.
Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and Dagenham. What did you find?
Well, so often the debate around immigration in our country is characterised by the numbers of people coming here, as you saw with the release of the statistics yesterday. But we don't spend nearly enough time actually thinking about what happens when people get here. And there is a real concern that we have communities in and around our country that are living divided and separate lives. Now, that is bad when you're talking about immigrant communities for newcomers, because it deprives them of access to opportunities, it leads to health inequalities, etc. And it's bad for the settled population because it leads to a lack of trust. And those two things leave a vacuum into which the peddlers of hate and division can step in. And unfortunately, we did see that happen somewhat during the, not just during the referendum campaign, but after. Obviously, there was the uptick in hate crime incidents, but also if you look at the research, 62% of second-generation immigrants, so people like me, born in this country, but of immigrant parents, 62% think that our country, following that referendum, has become less tolerant. And that is a bad thing, because if people don't feel welcomed and don't feel part of their communities, it's not going to encourage them to integrate, and integration is absolutely vital here.
Where does the onus lie? Because there are many arguments who say that it's up to the individual. You can't go into people's homes and drag them out, make them integrate, make them learn English, speak English. Where does the onus lie?
Well, I actually think integration is a two-way street. So I think definitely there is an obligation on central and local government to do what they can to ensure that when we have newcomers and population change in different communities, those communities get the funding and support that they need, but also that those communities ensure that they orientate newcomers to the community into its ways, its traditions, etc. But then, of course, for people coming here, it's right and reasonable to expect them to participate in the life of the country too. And one of the ways in which you do that, obviously, is by speaking English. And there are over 800,000 immigrants in our country, according to the last statistics on this from the Office for National Statistics, who don't speak English to a proficient level. And to be honest, that's not because immigrants don't want to learn English. Over what we found in the evidence we've taken is, the overwhelming majority of immigrants want to speak English, but often there are barriers there. So that's just an illustration of the way in which this is a two-way street, this whole issue. And of course, government can't, as you said, go into people's homes, but it can, given it sets the rules of the game, how we live, and controls funding, it can have an influence. And of course, employers who massively benefit from immigration, in terms of the skills that they bring, they've got a role to play too.
How do we balance this? Because yes, there are legitimate migrants who come to our country within the communities. They don't feel that they can integrate. There are second-generation migrant families who feel fearful, distrustful, but then there is a legitimate concern of migrants who come to, we've seen that across Europe, who come to these countries, who come to our country, who are terrorists. How do we balance it to welcome and integrate the majority of migrants, but also make sure that the minority don't get in?
Well, I think what you've just done there is something that people shouldn't do, which is to conflate issues of terror and the whole counter-extremism agenda with issues of integration. I mean, if you look at some of the most recent awful examples of terrorist incidents that have happened in the UK, they have been perpetrated by British people born and bred in this country. It hasn't necessarily been imported. And actually, to the extent that we have a problem in that respect, it's with regards to young Brits who've been radicalised, going abroad and fighting with Daesh in Syria, etc., and then coming back. But that was a homegrown issue. Now, I don't deny that, you know, there will be a small minority of immigrants who may engage in these kind of activities, but we've got to be very, very careful in conflating the two issues, because many of the perpetrators of these terrorist acts are they were born and bred here, speaking English well, were very integrated, and that's what we are getting at when we say got to be very, very careful about the way that we talk about these issues, and that we don't inflame matters, but we actually get to the root of the problem.
So how do we tackle this? Because you're dealing with very base emotions here. People are fearful, and when they're fearful, they do target the other. They see the other as a threat, and they're less likely to try and help with the integration process. And on the other side, you can see there's distrust there, there's fear there. So how do we tackle this as a country?
Well, one thing in terms of English, if people don't speak English, they can't have a relationship with their neighbours, understand where they're coming from, and that builds trust. So we need to ensure that we provide more funding for English language learning classes, and I think employers could maybe contribute to that. And maybe one of the recommendations we make in the report is putting in place a student loan type system, an income contingent loan system, where immigrants themselves can help fund that. Secondly, give areas more control over immigration policy. Why don't we devolve these immigration decisions to some extent to the localities and regions of our country in the way that they do in Canada, in the way that they do in Australia? To some extent, we've already done that a bit in Scotland by giving the Scottish Government the ability to bring in more immigrants. But, different parts of our country have different views about this and different needs. So here in London, for example, the London Chamber of Commerce wants to see there be like a London-style visa so that we can increase the number of people coming to London from abroad to help power the economy. Other parts of the country might not want to do that. If we give different regions more control, then I think there'll be more trust and confidence in the system, and less this impression that somehow the numbers coming here have been imposed on me by Westminster. If it's controlled and there's more kind of impetus here at a local and regional level, then I think people feel they have more control. And frankly, the businesses who always make the case for this, it gives them an incentive to actually sell the benefits of immigration in their local communities.
Okay, Chaka Mona, thanks a lot for chatting to us this afternoon.
Thank you.